You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
So I will continue to sit for a little bit longer, probably until the strength comes back. We are in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I want to start this morning by reading the passage on which the teaching is based. So we're going to read Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 13. It'll be on the screen behind me, and also it's on page 556 of your red pew Bibles. So here we go. We're going to start in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? This is the word of the Lord. Now, if you've been sort of coming, we've been in this book for a while, and what we have here in this book is a guy who calls himself the preacher. And he's essentially explaining to us what it means to be human, because he knows we spend most of our time trying to be God. And so the main refrain, which you saw a couple times in this passage here, is vanity. This idea that life is vanity, or vapor is kind of the base word. It's fleeting, it's ephemeral. You can't manipulate it, you can't predict it, you can't shape it into what you want it to be, you can't control it. And he's taken us all the way through, up to this point, different ways that we try and get some control and why those inevitably don't work and end up backfiring. And points out kind of along the way how trying to get control ends up being one of the main reasons we sort of kick other people when they kind of approach us, why we sometimes leverage other people for our own desires, or maybe even leverage God as a means for us to get our own desires. All sorts of bad things come from forgetting that we're human and how to be human under the sun. And he sums all that up in the first few verses this morning. Essentially, you aren't God, you can't dispute with God, he's stronger than you. And as long as you keep trying to do that, you're only hurting yourself. And what that means then is that part of being human is going to be coming into contact with uncomfortable realities. It's simply going to happen that we're going to come into contact with realities about life that we find not comfortable, that we don't like. And sometimes those are very big, uncomfortable realities, the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, a good friend suffering. Sometimes they're smaller, uncomfortable realities. Something going on in your life that you just would like to change, but you frankly can't. You just can't control it. And for a lot of us, that's happened this year. You look back and you see ways that these uncomfortable realities have asserted themselves. For other people, it's happened this week, maybe even this morning. And one of the biggest challenges that we face is how to handle these uncomfortable realities when they present themselves. We tend to live in fear of encountering them. Like a lot of us, when you think about why you might be worried or anxious, it's almost always in response to the idea that one of these uncomfortable realities might be around the corner. And we tend to be afraid of them because we don't know how to handle them when they're here, and clearly we don't like them. And so when they do happen, or when we think about them possibly happening, we tend to respond in maybe denial, we hide from them, we try and explain them away with sort of platitudes, Hallmark card style stuff about suffering, or we look at them square in the face and realize how powerful they are and how uncomfortable they make us. So we just kind of give them the keys to our heart and let them sort of drive the show from here on out. They're in control of our lives. And the preacher won't let us avoid reality that way. He won't let us live like ostriches constantly looking for a better place to hide. And so what he does is, especially in this passage, try and teach us how to not live superficial lives that tend to hide, that tend to deny, and teach us how to live life in a way that opens up to these uncomfortable realities and knows how to learn from them. And he's going to tell us that there are two real approaches to these realities. There's two ways of living, knowing that there would be a lot of uncomfortable things happening as a human being. One of them is the way of avoidance, and the other one is the way of wisdom. And that's what we'll do this morning. We're going to look at the way of avoidance and then the way of wisdom. And so first, the way of avoidance. It's a magazine called Escapism Magazine. It's a travel magazine, and it bills itself as it's for those with one eye on the job and the other on their next vacation. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about this. There's nothing wrong with vacations, by the way. But what I find fascinating is that they're essentially saying that the way you cope with having a job is making sure that one eye can be on your next vacation. Like, handling reality is allowable because you can look somewhere else at least some of the time to get your mind off of it. And the idea, what's really fascinating to me about this is that this is a monthly publication, and it's got a lot of pages. And so that means that there is no feasible way a human being can actually take all the vacations that are in Escapism Magazine. But that's not the point. And I think everyone knows that. The point isn't, maybe you'll take one or two. Maybe it'll help you figure out what vacation you're going to go on. But the point is that you can think about taking these different vacations. And in so doing, get that one eye, ideally both eyes, off of the cold, hard realities of your life and into how amazing that kind of vacation would be. Oh, look at that. That would be pretty great. This is how they sell subscriptions to Escapism Magazine. And the preacher is saying, essentially, that sort of escapism, this idea of if I can get one eye, preferably both, off of realities I don't want to look at, that's the ideal way to live. He says that escapism is kind of woven in to our approach to life. And that's what especially the first half of this passage, though we'll see kind of all of it, is about. He talks about, there's a house of mourning and a house of laughter. There's, sorrow and there's a house of mirth. There's all these things you can go back and forth in. And he's saying, when you look at this, this gives you a couple of options. And our default option, the reason you'd have to tell someone it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of laughter, is because our default option is to go to the house of laughter. Our default option is to focus on the positive, aim for the enjoyable, and do our best to avoid the rest of it. Because, look, everyone knows it's better to go to a party than a funeral. Like if I said, hey, what's more fun, party or funeral? It's not like going to be a hard question for you to answer. It's built into us to say we'd rather look at things that are enjoyable than things that are not. And that doesn't feel that weird to us, and it probably isn't that weird to not want to be uncomfortable. But the preacher comes in and says there's something built into that desire that can go really, really sour in your life. When you want to constantly escape uncomfortable realities, it can lead you down a really, really bad road. And one of the best people that has ever really spoken on this topic was lived hundreds of years ago. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and a Christian, and he wrote a bunch of stuff, but he wrote this thing called the Pensées, and it's basically like little mini essays, sometimes even one sentence, just like thoughts. And they're fascinating, and you should read them. But I tell you should read something like every week, so, read what you want. But they're great. And one of them, several of them have headings, and several of them have the heading diversion. and one under diversion, it's just this. He says, because people are not able to fight against death, misery, or ignorance, they have taken it into their heads, in order to be happy, not to think of them at all. The end. And it's meant to be the kind of thing you sort of dwell on a little bit. The idea is that we know that since we can't fight these uncomfortable realities, since they're realities, we do our best to escape them, to just not think about them, to have an escapism magazine for our whole life. And so, in other words, if you have to go to a funeral, distract yourself a little while you're there. I don't know, think about the flower arrangement. Wonder what's for lunch later. Think about what you're doing for the weekend. And then, so you don't have to think about those realities later on, because they have this nasty habit of creeping up even after you've left the funeral. Try and weave that kind of avoidance into the way you live your life in general, so you can focus your attention on other things all the time and never really have to worry about dealing with these realities. And that gives us a lot to explore. Like when the house of mourning presents itself, when this uncomfortable reality sort of asserts itself, where do you go? And there's a way of looking at all of these sort of proverbial sentences in poetry that he gives us here as avoidance tactics, different ways that we try and avoid uncomfortable realities in our life. Now, they are basically proverbs. In other words, they're sayings that you can get a lot out of. So there's more to them than just that. But the reason they seem to be all together is because they all can have this theme of avoidance. And so I want to work through some of these tactics because I think we're going to see ourselves when we look in the mirror of this sort of poem that he has. And the first one, and the longest one, is the tactic of distraction. This is really verses like 2 through 6, where he says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. The heart of the wise in the house of mourning, not in the house of mirth. He's basically saying you have this tendency to distract yourself from mourning with laughter. You have the tendency to distract yourself and avoid things via distraction. And so we probably have more opportunities today for distraction than they had then. They could go to the house of laughter, in other words, a social situation where everyone was laughing. They can go to a feast. Today, we have all sorts of ways that we can distract ourselves. One is an actual house of laughter, basically a kind of socializing that allows you to not have to think about uncomfortable things. And that's the motivation for, a decent amount of people, I think, who organize their life around the next party, the next dinner party, the next night out, the next fun thing we're going to do, this sort of thing. It doesn't have to be raging parties either. It doesn't have to be that sort of stereotype. It can be going to the Getty and enjoying some art before you get everyone to go down to the Philharmonic downtown, and hear some music. And then we're all going to afterwards go get some dinner on 3rd Street, at this new restaurant. These are not necessarily, raging, debauched things. But there's a way that we can use these kind of enjoyable things as a means of distracting ourselves from what's really going on in our life. It could be sophisticated. It could be, we're going to go to the beach in the morning, then go on a hike in the afternoon, then drive somewhere not LA to look at the stars at night. This kind of enjoyable issue, this enjoying the city, enjoying nature, can be just because you like to do it. Or it can be a way to avoid thinking about reality, distracting yourself with enjoyment. There's plenty of other ways, too. Whole social circles can develop around this idea. And you know this because you've probably been in a few, where there's this sort of unspoken rule that when this group of people is together, we don't talk about a bunch of stuff that's a downer. This is not sort of the thing that we do. And if you try and bring it up, we're going to sort of make sure that that's not what we do here. There's an unspoken agreement, like in verse 6, that we won't ever give rebukes. We won't ever sort of push one another to deal with our problems. And social circles fall apart this way too. When someone shines a mirror on your life and you see uncomfortable realities, avoidance says you just kind of stop texting them, and you'll feel better. Just make it go away. Because I'd rather hear the crackling of thorns. I'd rather hear this fire that won't produce much heat that just makes a bunch of noise than I would someone saying something substantive to me. Because that's the agreement. I'm trying to distract myself from those things. I'd prefer you not bring them up. There's other ways too. Activity is a big one. Subtle but big. John Irving in, what was it called? I've probably written down. Cider House Rules, one of his novels. He talked about this character that he said he was the kind of person who occupied his emotions with a task. And it's this idea that, a lot of us, we often complain about being busy, and then we say yes to every conceivable opportunity and make ourselves busier and then complain about being busier. Why do we keep adding things? Because and not everyone, some people are just busy, but at some point, it's easier to be busy than to be broken, just flat out. And so, if there's something to grieve, what do people say? Got to stay busy. You got to get back to work. Now, sometimes it's nice when you're grieving, to have something to do for a while, to pause in between deep grief. But sometimes you're staying busy so you won't have to grieve. If you're facing up to an uncomfortable reality in your life, isn't that the weird thing where it's it's amazing how long it's been since I've cleaned out the refrigerator. Someone really should dust this apartment. There's so much to do. I haven't sorted my mail in how long? There's these amazing ways to procrastinate when there's an uncomfortable reality to avoid. You get very, very active. And often, maybe the most common way of distraction is in creating or sort of engaging in kind of false realities. engaging in sort of these kind of distractions that take you away from reality. This is a lot of the time the reason why I think we end up watching as much TV as we do. Not always. Sometimes you're just watching a show. But sometimes you're watching a show so you don't have to think. And it can be a lighthearted sitcom, or it can be like a really heavy drama that makes you cry a lot, but you know about the heavy drama. You get to turn that off when you're done with it. You just can't turn off your life. I remember when my son he's probably 2, and he had, I don't know, a cold or something, and he was having a hard time, and we ended up calling the advice nurse, and the advice nurse said, "Can you see his ribs when you breathe?" And I said, "Yeah, but I can always see his ribs." And he said, "Well, if you can see his ribs, you got to call the ambulance." And I'm like, okay, well, I don't think he needs an ambulance, but I probably don't want to be the dad that didn't call the ambulance. So I called it, and sure enough, here come like 8 giant firemen. They plot on in, and they take my 2-year-old and my wife away in an ambulance, and I'm just sitting there in the house, just like. And one of the weirdest parts of that, not knowing, they didn't say like, "Oh, he's fine." They put him in the ambulance and lit the sirens up and tore out of there. So one of the weirdest things for me was this really strong urge to turn on the TV. That's weird. But I think you know that feeling. It doesn't have to be television. It doesn't have to be film. Like social media this way. The news cycle is this way. Novels can be this way. Art can be this way. Where there's this constant stream of new things and thoughts and opinions and experiences and news items that you can constantly refresh. And they make you feel like you're living in reality. But all they do is take you away from the actual reality you're in right now. You're just thinking about a bunch of other stuff that frankly doesn't really affect you. And there's a way to be well-informed, then there's a way to just do it as a distraction. Because you'd rather think about those things than actual life that you're living. Distraction. There's more, and I have to go faster on some of these, though they're very, very interesting and thorough in our lives. The second one is indulgence. You can sort of avoid by indulging. In verse 7 it says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart." Now, the idea is that sometimes the realities of life, the vanity of life, these uncomfortable realities show up. And if they show up and someone is also maybe offering you some money or a shortcut to sort of get ahead, that you might just go, "You know what, I'm just going to go for it." Even a wise person can find it hard to resist this sort of disengaging from your responsibilities. Because, you know what, life's just kind of hard right now. Maybe I kind of deserve this. And that's the distraction of indulgence. It can be, overt, like taking a bribe. It can be subtle, like taking sort of an ethical shortcut at work. It can be culturally accepted, like distracting yourself with like really good food or with shopping or something along these sorts of lines. But you distract yourself by the uncomfortable realities in your life, or avoid the uncomfortable realities in your life by indulging. I indulge in this so I can avoid that. Indulgence. Then there's, this one's interesting, action. Verse 8. "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit." The idea here is there's someone who can't work through something. They can't wait to figure out what it is. They have to act now. Because, why sit around and endure something when I can fix it? And so is a friend hurting? Well, you know what? You go and you buy a book, and you give them the book on how to hurt better, and you schedule coffee, from 2 to 3 p.m. every Friday, and you have a curriculum for how you're going to help them get better, because you don't like that they're suffering, so you're going to fix them. Are you grieving? You're going to read up on the 5 stages of grief. You know not to do denial, so deny denial, and then we're going to move right through anger, get mad for a couple of hours, then get on to bargaining, and we're going to get into a Guinness World Record of grieving and get through the other side of this thing. Why deal with something when you can just get busy fixing it? And the preacher says, no, there's pride in that, because you aren't actually in control of this stuff. Some things, a lot of things, can't be fixed. They just have to be borne, endured, walked through. And a lot of us try and avoid the discomfort of that by saying, no, I'm going into action. I'm going to get this thing going. Another one is emotion. In verse 9, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." Interestingly enough, anger can also be a way of escape. Any extreme emotion, if you find your emotions running wild, sometimes, if you look at them, you realize it's kind of on purpose. Because oddly enough, if something that's uncomfortable can make you really mad or really sad or whatever, at least you can sort of look at your emotions and all the anger and all the rage and get your eyes a little bit off of the things that you think is causing it. And so you can find yourself emoting as a way of avoiding what's really going on in your life. This other one, this one's interesting. I think I have two more. Imagination. In verse 10 it says, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." And you remember verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. Now, in verse 1, the idea is essentially, if you smell good, people will like when you come into a room. This is the Cliff Notes baseline version. Precious ointment, you smell nice. But if you have a bad name, like you're kind of a jerk and you're mean to everybody, no matter how good you smell, they're eventually going to figure it out. And then he says, the day of death's better than the day of birth. And he's trying to sort of compare these things. And he says, when someone's born, like a one-day-old kid, you know nothing about that kid. It's very exciting, but you know nothing. All you know is potential, the imagination of what they could be. But the day of death, there's no more potential. You have to deal with the reality that these were actual people who made actual choices, that they're finite. They're not just endless what could be. There's actual reality you have to deal with about that person's life, who they really were. And in that sense, the day of death tells you more than the day of birth. But isn't there a way that we can try and avoid uncomfortable realities by thinking just about potential and not about reality? By imagining a future where things are going to be different. And imagine how different it's going to be when this changes or this changes. Just focus on the potential. Tell yourself the story that everything's just right around the corner. But it's imaginary. And then in verse 10, it talks about how we can also do that in reverse. How you can, with nostalgia, look back to the good old days. Remember when things were good and nothing was bad, and if things were a little bad, they weren't really bad like they are now. Like now it's really bad. Back then it was only a little bad, and it wasn't even really that bad. There's this, nostalgia is just the same imagination in reverse. It's like fish stories. If you've ever fished, you know that the fish stories, it's a genre of literature, the fish story. And what happens is, you have someone on a boat, and they're sitting around, and they're not catching any fish. So what do you got to do? You have two options. You can either say, imagine the fish we're going to catch tomorrow. I mean, we could catch a 10-footer tomorrow. Or you could remember back then, when you caught that 1-foot fish. Wait, was it 1 foot or was it 2? It might have actually been 6. Yeah, I remember right now, it was 10. It was a 10-foot fish. And that's exactly what we do. 1 year after last year, it was an okay year. 5 years after last year, it was a pretty good year. 2 decades after last year, it was the best, it was the golden age of my life. It's a fish story, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. You can look backwards in imagination and live in that past, or you can look forward in potential and live in that imaginary future, all so that you don't have to live like right now. Because right now, you're just here. And in that sense, he says, there's no wisdom in asking this, because what's the point of asking about the old days? It's just so you can sort of have the imagination and have the hit and the fix and sort of move on. You have to live now. Now there's more. The last one's probably extraordinarily important, that we'll spend only a little bit of time on it. Wisdom. Even wisdom can be an escape valve for you, can be a way of avoidance. Look what he says. He talks in verses 11 and 12 about how good wisdom is. It's an unequivocal good. Whoop, I'm losing notes. Wisdom helps. And my ankles hurt, so I can't go get them. Don't get up and get it. Some of you would do that. I love you. I'm okay. Don't get, what you have to do is you begin to look at wisdom and you go, yes, this is a very, very good thing. It's a wonderful, unequivocally good thing. However, what ends up happening is, notice verse 13. He finishes the poem not saying, all these are foolishness. Wisdom, though, that's where it's at. No, he has to end it saying, consider the work of God. You can't make straight the things that he made crooked. In other words, if you think wisdom is going to be a way to avoid the uncomfortable realities of life, you too are wrong. You too can't straighten out what God's made crooked. And there's a way we can do that, can't we? Where you have this idea that if I know enough about life or about grieving or about some pet kind of hobby horse that I have, I can get a little distance on reality and begin to sort of look at it from a detached point of view, which is just so much easier to be detached. And so you can say it can be the wisdom of expertise. You know what I do? I've studied a ton about grief and grieving and suffering, and I know there's 8 different ways to handle them, and so I'm going to sort of, and I'm in the middle of it now, but I can sort of take a step back from it and look at it. No, you're in it. You can do it with experience. I've been around the block a few times, seen people grieve in different ways, see people handle things different ways. I have a sense if I can get a step back. No, you're in it. And you can do it a lot of really subtle ways. If you're a really cynical person, there's a good shot that at least some of that cynicism is built to allow you to detach from the problems of life. Because at least I can just sort of get a little distance on it by being cynical and sarcastic and whatever else about it. There's ways you do it with your hobby horse stuff. I see suffering out there, someone's suffering. The real suffering in the world is, I don't know, pick your poison, politics. And let me tell you my thoughts on politics. And then all of a sudden, here we go. And are we dealing with, no, now we're off somewhere else. Wisdom can be an avoidance technique. And that brings up an extraordinarily important point, which is, so can religion. There are religious versions of all these, not least of which is the wisdom version of religion, where we say things, we don't say it out loud, but what we end up doing is something along these lines. This says the house of mourning, the wise are in the house of mourning. We say, yes, and thank God now I'm in the house of glib Bible verses that make everything okay. There's a sense where we go, oh good, I have Romans 8:28 on my coffee cup, and my problems have now, magically disappeared. It's amazing how I don't have to deal with them if I just focus on this. There's a way that we can also, in religion, there's versions of all of these things. There's ways of avoiding sorrow. We got sad once, but now we got saved. So we don't have to deal with that anymore. That's just great. I was in the house of mourning, but then I heard about eternal life. So you know what? Whatevs. That was a tough few minutes before I learned about eternal life. There's ways that you can do it with, we're just nostalgic for a time when people knew God and were more moral, Or we're just, we are excited because what's around the corner? I guarantee it, revival. So I definitely don't have to live right now. I'm just going to think about that. There's ways that you can take great things where, things have, it's not like revival couldn't be around the corner. There's all sorts of things that can be true, but you're leveraging those things as a means of avoiding reality right now. You're doing this in an avoidance move. And so that's, it's important to know that. When you come here, you're not coming here to forget what's going on in the real world or to forget what's going on in your life. You're coming here to bring the reality of God to bear on the reality going on in your life. This isn't a place where we come in to deny reality and then go back out there and have to face it with a little more, mojo. This is where we come in and we see that God actually is real, and that makes a difference on the things in our life. We're not in the business of escaping, of denial, of avoidance. We're in the business of looking at the full reality, including God, which is easy to forget sometimes. This is the way of avoidance. Now, you put this all together, and I would forgive you for thinking, okay, so I can't, read a book unless it's about everyone dying. And, there's some Shakespeare and, Cormac McCarthy or something. There's some books about that you could do. I need to go hang out at funeral homes all the time, just, being biblical. There's a way you can sort of take this. That's not the point. There is a way. The point isn't, don't do those things. The point is, we have a built-in tendency to use enjoyable good things as a way of avoiding uncomfortable realities. We have a way of misusing good things to try and allow for more avoidance in our life. There's a way to spend time with good friends, to read a good book, to watch a sitcom that's actually a part of living life here and now on the earth. There is a way to couple actual enjoyment with actual difficulty in the same life. That's a real thing. But there are many ways you can use this stuff as an escape from reality. And in as much as you do, you end up turning it into a kind of drug. And you see that because you watch yourself as you get a little older, you watch other people as they get a little older with you, and you find that if you pick one of these things and use them a lot, the returns start to diminish, the law of diminishing returns. And so you need to do a little more avoiding to get to the same place you got to before. And then a little more and a little more. And you end up being more and more frantic, more and more divorced from real life when you take the way of avoidance. And so that's the question. And it starts small. So the question is, what's your escape? What are the ways that you take some of these good things and use them to avoid uncomfortable realities? And are you on a trajectory where that's going to end up being harder and harder, so you need to do it more and more, and you end up living life divorced from reality? The way of avoidance runs deep in us, is what the preacher's saying. That's point one. There's only 2 points, so don't get worried. Point two, you're used to 3, I have to warn you. The way of wisdom. Now, clearly he said wisdom is good and helpful, but not as a means of avoidance, not as a means of not having to actually live your life. So how is it helpful then? Well, it's helpful inasmuch as wisdom is about being acquainted with the realities of life, all of them, even the uncomfortable ones. Wisdom is keeping your eyes open to all the different parts of life and dealing with them as God would see fit. And so you notice this is a pretty internal thing. It clearly can't be just, okay, so I got to go find a mortuary, I guess. What you have to do is do something very internal. Because look at, verses 1 through 4. Let's do verse 2 through 4. He talks about how, it's better to go to the house of mourning because the living will lay the truth they find there to heart, lay it to heart. In verse 3, by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. In verse 4, it's about where the hearts of the wise and the foolish are. At some level, the idea here is that you would make some kind of internal adjustment, internalizing the lessons these uncomfortable realities have to teach us when you have the chance, and then carrying those things with you. Because notice that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. In other words, they're carrying the house of mourning with them to some degree. It's informing the rest of the way they live their life. Because the whole point of a funeral for us these days, typically, is get some closure and move on. But the preacher says that's not the point of a funeral. The point isn't sort of, reduce it to platitudes. We're not here to mourn a death, we're here to celebrate a life. Who in the world said you couldn't do both of those things at the same time? So we're trying to celebrate so we don't have to mourn. There's a way of avoidance in that. We want to get closure and move on. You can do it with sort of these other platitudes. You can do it by trying to just normalize it. Everyone dies, circle of life, as though somehow if we repeat that in a calm tone of voice, it makes it not a big deal. And the preacher says, no, that's not it. There are lessons here. You can't neuter those lessons. You have to take them into your heart. You have to lay them to heart. Now, what are those lessons? I'll tell you, there are two of them. One of them is that death teaches us that we're finite. It teaches the lesson of Ecclesiastes. Uncomfortable realities teach us that we're supposed to be human, not be God. And that when we try and be God, we're going to bump into uncomfortable realities that show us we're not. In that way, it ties into the rest of the book. The lesson of learning that you're finite, the lesson of learning that when you go to a funeral, it's not just for that person, it'll eventually be for you. The lesson there is not just a morbid one, it's also one that in some ways can open doors to less avoidance and more enjoyment in your life here and now. I was talking with someone this week who had sort of a brush with mortality. There was a question about their physical condition for a while. And she was telling me, I said, well, what was that like? And she said, well, it was actually kind of strange because as much as I found myself worrying and thinking about these sorts of things, I also found myself enjoying my daily life somehow more because I was looking around and realizing I'm not complaining as much. I'm looking at my kids as gifts when I used to look at them as kind of pains half the day. There were just ways that I found myself this is what I've been given, and I'm able to kind of just take that and enjoy it because I'm not fixated on avoiding other things. I'm just kind of here in the present. And that's what the author of Ecclesiastes has been teaching us the whole time, hasn't he? There's nothing better for a person than to enjoy their lot, than to enjoy the toil God's given them for their time under the sun. He says the lessons that facing up to uncomfortable realities teach you is that you're finite and that can push you in this direction. What we tend to do, I think one of the reasons we like to avoid is because we think, when you go to, you have some sort of outpatient surgery or something, right? So they're gonna dental work, or I once had a cortisone shot in my wrist. And the first thing they do is they inject a local anesthetic. So just the part that's gonna hurt gets numb. And then they can do their stuff, right? That's what Novocaine is, just local anesthetic. And what we try and do with avoidance is we try and do that same thing with our soul. We wanna get some local anesthetic for the soul. I just wanna numb the part that's gonna hurt. And everything else can stay the same. But that's not how the soul works. There's no local anesthetic for the soul. There's only general anesthesia for the soul. You can't constrain the numbness to just one area. It's going to spread. And so that means then that you are either going to choose a life seeking distraction and avoidance and then live all of your life a little bit numb. Or you can be lucid, but then have to face all of life, including the uncomfortable stuff. And at some point, I think because we know that spread of the anesthesia, don't you feel, some of you are in the middle of uncomfortable realities now. I don't wish them on you, but I've been there, and I know how lucid you can feel. There's an awareness you have right now, maybe, that you haven't had before, about what's important, about what life is like. And those of you that it's been a while since you've been in that situation, you feel a little numb. There's a little bit of a blur, just a little sometimes. And every time we try and avoid, every time we try and fill our lives with activity or one of these other things, it just gets a little bit heavier, the anesthesia. And we get a little bit more distance from living real life fully present. This is the idea. That's one of the things, that's one of the lessons death and these uncomfortable realities teach us, is that you have to face up to all of them. And then you have a lucidity, a clarity that actually allows you to look at your life as a gift. But there's more. There has to be more. Because in verse 13, look at verse 13. It says, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? Now, in other words, truly laying these lessons to heart is not just about you looking at the way you've conducted your life. If you really understand the lessons of these uncomfortable realities, they will also force you to look up and consider the work of God, the author of the universe, and how his work factors into this. And so, in other words, death inevitably teaches us that other answers just come up short. Simply appreciating life more, while there's a lot of benefit in it, doesn't solve the problem of death, the problem of finitude, the problem of suffering. It can help us pass the time being more grateful, but there's still an understanding that the house of mourning, one day, we're going to be there, and it's all going to end. One day the joy is over. I think the deep reason we distract ourselves, we do all this avoidance, is not because death is just sort of uncomfortable, but because we have a sense that death will one day rob us of absolutely everything. It takes everyone you love from you and everything you love from you, and then it takes you. At some level, it's really hard to cope with that, even if you realize how finite you are and you can enjoy your days until then a little more. And this is where Pascal comes in handy again. Another thing he said, despite all of his afflictions, man wants to be happy. He can't help wanting to be happy. But how can he be happy? The best thing would be to make himself immortal. But he can't do that. So he's decided just to stop thinking about it. This is why we avoid. He also said, famous line, the sole cause of a person's unhappiness is that he or she does not know how to stay quietly in their room. You can't just be, because then these thoughts creep up. And you realize, Peter Kreeft commented on that particular pensée. He said, if you're typically modern, your life is like a mansion with a terrifying hole right in the middle of the living room floor. So you paper over the hole with a very busy wallpaper pattern to distract yourself. Or say, you find a rhinoceros in the middle of your house. The rhinoceros is wretchedness and death. How in the world can you hide a rhinoceros? Easy. Cover it with 1,000,000 mice. Multiple diversions. He says, the reason you're not diverting yourself just because you want to have a little more fun. You need 1,000,000 mice. You need multiple diversions. You need to be this creative with all the ways that you can follow the way of avoidance. Just so that you can not have to just live resigned to the fact that there's a giant rhinoceros in the middle of your life. It's not just stoicism, the preacher's saying. It's not just, resign yourself to the fact that you're going to face death. Whatever philosophy you want to use to deal with it, that's just fine. It's not just don't distract yourself all the time. It's also, you have to face up to these realities in a certain way. These realities, you have to let them lay on your heart, not just some things that you want to listen to about your life and how we're going to face up to reality. You also have to let them force you to consider the work of God. And what is the work of God? Ecclesiastes in this way kind of opens the door to the rest of the Bible. And I'll tell you, where we go to see the work of God, where we go to see it in its fullness, is the work of God in Jesus Christ, who never avoided you. There's a way of understanding, you go to see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you see him struggling. You see him straining, about to face the wrath of God for your sins and for mine. You see him sweating blood. You see him hurting. You see him asking a couple of human beings to pray with him, and they can't even do that. And why would he even ask? He needs, this is a difficult time for him. And it's fascinating because in that moment, do you know what the uncomfortable reality was in the life of Jesus Christ? It was us. We were the thing he had to face up to. The discomfort was the fact that there was wrath that needed to be paid for the plan to go through, for the plan that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit had made before the fullness of time. And he in the garden, sweating blood and crying tears, cries out, If there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. If there's a way to not have to face up to this uncomfortable reality of these people and what they require and who they're being right now while they require it of me when they fall asleep on me in my moment of deepest need, if there's a way to get out from under this, I would like to take it. Can I avoid this? And how does he end his prayer? Not my will, but your will be done. He never avoided me. He never avoided you. And so he goes to the cross and he squares up to an uncomfortable reality that because of him, those who trust will never have to face. He took the most uncomfortable reality from you, if you believe. He took it. The real discomfort, the real uncomfortable reality is gone. And in that way, you now are able to see, God doesn't turn his face away from you as a means of escape, as a means of avoidance. He turns his face away from the Son so that we can be brought close. Now that is the kind of thing that frees you to face up then to the realities of life in lots of ways. And we don't have time to go through them all. Who knows if there is enough time to go through them all. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to look at the realities of life instead of running from them. Because you know that the ultimate uncomfortable reality is not ever going to be something you face in Jesus Christ. And so now, this is what you lay to heart. You don't just lay to heart that you're going to die and look around life as a gift. You also lay to heart the fact that Jesus died in your place by not avoiding the discomfort. And therefore, you are now free to walk through life the way he walked through life. You can face up to these things because he's with you. Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? And there's a Christian escapist version of that. You know it. It's, I'm so glad I met God so I can walk around the valley of the shadow of death. That was really awesome that he leapfrogged me over the valley of the shadow of death. It was, the giant Jesus trampoline that got me right over the top of it. There's a way to do that. And maybe you have that tendency, or maybe you know someone who does. But that's not what the psalm says. How do you walk through the valley of the shadow of death? How do you face up to it and not deny it and not hide yourself from it and not go the way of avoidance? Well, I know that you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. If he didn't turn his face away from the uncomfortable reality that was your punishment for sin, that was your rebellion, that was you kicking and screaming and frankly just being awful to him in so many subtle and often underhanded ways, if he didn't do that to you, do you think he'd ever not walk you through whatever uncomfortable reality you have to face? Do you really need to turn to avoidance, to heaping up activities, to covering over your emotions with a task, to being a fixer that fixes? Do you really need those things anymore? At some point, you know you don't. And so that enables you to become someone who doesn't just face up to those realities, but also you can become someone who's like Jesus, who now actually moves towards the suffering instead of moving away from them, who can have genuine sympathy because you're not so busy avoiding discomfort, who can understand what he means when he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." You become people who understand that reality will strip away all of your distractions and all of your avoidance, but it also will fill you with hope if you face up to it and lay it to heart. Because you'll know that what's wrong will be made right, even if you don't know when. And you'll know that he'll be with you along the way, even when it does hurt. And it will hurt, but it will never hurt as much as it hurt him. Okay, let's pray. Father, we're thankful for who you are and what you've done. We're glad to have watched, and to continually watch you enter our lives despite the discomfort that it caused Jesus Christ. There was great suffering. There was precious blood that was shed for our sake. Help us see the love that was in that act. Help us see the love that continues and flows from it in the promise of your Holy Spirit to be always with us. And Jesus promised himself that he's with us always, even to the end of the age. Let us not avoid, but face up to this life, knowing you are with us always. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.